2,300 cardinals in waiting, one Easter morning, and a single sentence that made half the Catholic press stop what it was doing. It was not a decree. It was not a warning. It was a letter. 4 paragraphs, written in the quiet cadence of a man who had once been a missionary in Peru and never quite stopped thinking like one. And the line that mattered was not the one about doctrine, it was the one about listening. That is where this begins. On the morning after Easter, in the spring of 2026, a letter went out from the papal apartments to every member of the College of Cardinals scattered across the world, in Manila, in Kinshasa, in Bogota, in the quiet residences of Rome itself. It was not the kind of communication that usually makes headlines. Popes write to cardinals often enough, but something about this one travelled. Vatican correspondents, who had covered 3 or 4 pontificates, said they could not remember the last time a papal letter to the college felt this personal, this warm, this quietly demanding. Pope Leo XIV opened not with instruction, but with gratitude, telling the cardinals that during the Easter season he wished to convey his heartfelt and fraternal greetings, in the hope that the peace of the risen Lord might sustain and renew a suffering world. It was a small phrase, but it set the tone for everything that followed. A suffering world, spoken to men who carry red hats and sit in marble halls, reminded gently that the point of the office was never the marble. He went further. He told them he was renewing his gratitude for their participation in the consistory held that January, and he praised, with unusual specificity, the quality of what had happened in that room. He said he greatly appreciated the work carried out in the small groups, the free and concrete and spiritually fruitful exchanges, and the notable quality of the interventions made during the plenary sessions. To an outsider, this might read as ordinary diplomatic warmth, but inside the Vatican press corps, something registered differently. Popes do not typically thank cardinals for arguing well, and that, several analysts suggested, might be exactly what he was doing, thanking men for disagreeing constructively, for bringing friction into a room that for years had often preferred silence. The most striking sentence came near the end. The compiled contributions, he wrote, constitute a resource of lasting value, which he hoped would be reflected on further and would mature through ecclesial discernment. It was a sentence built almost entirely out of patience, not a resolution, not a ruling, a promise that the conversation itself would be allowed to keep growing, slowly. The way a seed matures in soil, no one is allowed to dig up too early. He signed it simply, Leo XIV, no embellishment, no grandeur, just a name and a papal seal, sent to men who had spent decades inside a system that often prized control over patience, and who now found themselves being told, gently, to keep talking. It is worth pausing here, because the reaction to that letter reveals something the letter itself never states outright. Catholic commentators across the ideological spectrum began parsing every clause. Traditionalists searched for signs of doctrinal drift. Reformists searched for signs of doctrinal drift in the opposite direction. And in the middle, a great many ordinary Catholics simply noticed that their Pope had written to his most senior collaborators not as a monarch addressing subordinates, but as a brother writing to brothers, in a season devoted to resurrection. The letter did not resolve any of the Church's tensions. What it did was signal how the man at the centre intended to hold them. To understand why this small letter carried such weight, it helps to go back roughly a year to the very first time Pope Leo XIV stood before this same College of Cardinals as their new Pope. It was the 10th of May, 2025, 2 days after his election, in the new Synod Hall at the Vatican, the same amphitheatre where the cardinals had gathered for their pre-conclave meetings before entering the sealed chapel that made him Pope. He began, notably, not with policy, but with prayer, asking those gathered to pray together in Latin, the Pater Noster, the Ave Maria, before he had said a single word of his own composition. Only after that did he speak. He told them plainly that the days behind them had been sad, because of the death of Pope Francis, and demanding, because of the responsibilities they had carried together, but also, and this was the phrase that stayed with people, rich in grace and consolation in the spirit. He called the cardinals his closest collaborators. He said their presence had been a great comfort to him in accepting what he called a yoke clearly far beyond his own limited powers, as it would be for any man. There was no performance of confidence there. There was, instead, an admission that the office was heavier than any one person could carry alone, and that he intended, from the very first hour, to carry it with them rather than above them. He explained, in that same address, why he had chosen the name Leo. Not primarily out of reverence for tradition, though that mattered too, but because Pope Leo XIII had once addressed the great social question of his age, the First Industrial Revolution, with an encyclical that reshaped how the church thought about labour, dignity, and justice. Leo XIV said the church now stood at the edge of a new industrial revolution, one built not of steel and steam, but of algorithms and artificial intelligence, and that this new age posed its own new challenges to human dignity, to justice, to the meaning of work itself. It was, in a single paragraph, a pope explaining that the name on his shoulders was not decoration, it was a mission statement. And then came the detail that Vatican watchers would return to again and again in the months ahead. After his prepared remarks, Pope Leo XIV opened the floor. He told the cardinals this was an opportunity many of them had asked for, a genuine dialogue, a chance to hear their advice, their suggestions, their concrete proposals, many of which had already been discussed in the tense, uncertain days before the conclave that elected him. He did not simply deliver a speech and depart. He stayed. He listened. In a room built for centuries around hierarchy, he built in, quite deliberately, a moment of horizontal conversation. It is worth slowing down here, because this is the small tender image the whole story turns on. Picture the room. Red robes filling tiered seating, men who had spent that same week debating fiercely, in secret, about who should lead them, now sitting together with the man they had chosen, watching him set aside his prepared text to ask what they thought. Not what they wanted to hear him say, what they actually thought. For an institution often accused, fairly or not, of speaking only downward, that gesture, small, procedural, easy to miss in a wire service summary, was the real headline. A pope who built listening into the architecture of his very first formal appearance. That instinct did not fade with time. It hardened into a pattern. 8 months later, in January of 2026, Pope Leo XIV convened another consistory, this one focused on 2 deliberately chosen topics. Synodality, the ongoing church-wide project of learning to walk together in decision-making, and Pope Francis's earlier exhortation on evangelization, known by its Latin title, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. The cardinals did not simply receive instruction on these themes, they voted on which topics to take up. Even the choosing of what to discuss was handed, in part, back to them. Then, in April, 3 months later, came the letter that opened this story, the Easter letter, thanking the cardinals for what had happened in those January sessions, and, notably, reflecting at length on the substance of what Francis had written about mission. Pope Leo XIV described that earlier exhortation as something once recognised, in the wider church, as a breath of fresh air, language capable of starting processes of pastoral and missionary conversion, rather than demanding immediate structural reform, and in doing so, profoundly guiding the church's journey. He wrote that this journey touches the very quality of spiritual life itself, expressed in the primacy of prayer, in witness that comes before words, and in the coherence between what a person believes and how a person lives. At the level of ordinary parish life, he said, this calls for a shift, away from a pastoral approach focused merely on maintenance and toward one genuinely oriented around mission. He went even further, describing what he hoped Catholic communities themselves would become. Living agents of proclamation. Communities that are welcoming. Communities that use language people can actually understand. Communities attentive to the quality of relationships, capable of offering real places for listening, accompaniment, and healing. Read quickly. This might sound like standard homiletic encouragement. Read slowly. It is something closer to a quiet critique. A pope telling his most senior officials that too many Catholic communities have become places of maintenance rather than mission, and asking them, gently but unmistakably, to help change that. From all of this, he wrote, flows what he called a profoundly unified understanding of mission. One that is, in his words, Christ-centered and kerygmatic. It is born, he said, of an encounter with Christ capable of transforming lives and spreading through attraction rather than conquest. That phrase, attraction rather than conquest, is perhaps the single most quoted line to come out of that Easter letter, because it reframes, in 6 words, centuries of assumptions about how the church is supposed to grow. Not by winning arguments, not by claiming territory, by becoming itself something people want to draw near to. He described this integral mission as one that holds in balance explicit proclamation, witness, commitment, and dialogue, yielding neither to the temptation of proselytism nor to a merely institutional mindset, focused only on preservation or expansion. And then, in a passage that landed with particular force among Catholics in parts of the world where the Church exists as a small minority, he wrote that even when the Church finds herself outnumbered, she is called to live with confident courage, as a small flock bringing hope to all. mindful that the aim of mission is not her own survival, but the communication of the love with which God loves the world. For cardinals serving in regions where Catholics are a tiny fraction of the population, men shepherding communities of a few thousand faithful inside nations of tens of millions, that sentence was not abstract theology. It was a direct address to their daily reality, telling them that smallness was never the problem to be solved. This is the moment worth holding on to, not a decree from a distant throne, but a pope, writing during the same week his own election as a young cardinal, now presided over its first anniversary, reaching out to men across every continent to say, in effect, your smallness is not your failure, it may be your calling. It is the kind of line easy to walk past in a press summary, and impossible to walk past if it happens to describe your own life. And then he said something even more striking. Barely 2 months after that Easter letter, on the 26th of June, 2026, Pope Leo XIV convened the cardinals once more. This time an extraordinary consistory, held in the Paul VI Hall, the modern audience hall whose sweeping, shell-like architecture has hosted everything from papal addresses to rock concerts. Extraordinary consistories are, by definition, not routine. They are called when something requires the college's collective attention in a way ordinary business does not. And what Pope Leo XIV asked of them, opening that 2-day gathering, was almost startlingly direct. He told them plainly, I need your freedom, your frankness, and your loyalty. Sincere counsel, he said, is always an act of communion. It is difficult to overstate how unusual that sentence is coming from the man sitting on the chair of Peter. Popes ask for prayers. Popes ask for obedience. This pope asked, in the same breath, for frankness, for cardinals willing to disagree with him, openly, as an expression not of division, but of unity. He was not asking them to agree. He was asking them to be honest and telling them that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is itself a form of loyalty. He reminded them of something he had said back in January, that these gatherings existed to help both the cardinals and the Pope himself learn how to work together in the service of the Church, to continue, in his words, a conversation that helps me in the service of the mission and of the whole Church. Notice the phrasing, not a conversation that helps them serve him, a conversation that helps him serve the mission. It is a small grammatical inversion with enormous implications for how a papacy understands its own centre of gravity. Communion, he told them that day, is never achieved once and for all. It requires daily conversion, it requires prayer, it requires trusting relationships, and it requires, he said this almost as a warning to himself as much as to them, a willingness to listen to one another again and again, without assuming the work of listening is ever finished. For an institution measured in centuries, the idea that unity has to be rebuilt daily rather than simply inherited is close to radical. Over those 2 days, the cardinals worked through 4 major themes, each one chosen not to comfort but to confront. First, the world itself, the actual world the Church exists inside, not an idealised version of it. Pope Leo XIV told them that situational awareness, a clear-eyed reading of the present moment, would help them recognise Christ walking in the streets of the world, going ahead of them through history rather than waiting passively for history to arrive at the Vatican's door. Second, they examined what he called the contrast between a culture of power and a civilization of love, a phrase drawn, deliberately, from his own encyclical, Magnifica Humanitas, released earlier that year. He noted, with evident weight, that many of the cardinals in that hall came from countries scarred by war, and he acknowledged that no society anywhere is untouched by conflict, domination, or division. He invited every cardinal present to take that encyclical not as a document to be filed away, but as a key, a practical tool for understanding the struggles of their own local churches, wherever in the world those churches happen to be. The third theme turned outward again, toward the Church's contribution to what he called the common good of humanity, a deliberate refusal to let the conversation collapse inward into purely internal Church politics. Rather than asking the cardinals to focus only on internal concerns, Pope Leo XIV invited them to look outward, to ask how the Church might proclaim the gospel with greater fidelity, greater freedom, and greater credibility in a world watching closely and, in many places, sceptically. He stressed, in language that echoed his Easter letter almost exactly, that mission is not one task among many for the Church. It is, he said, her reason for existing. And because it is her reason for existing, it demands listening, it demands shared responsibility, and it demands the collective discernment of the Holy Spirit's guidance, not the private discernment of one man, however elevated his office. By the close of that extraordinary consistory, On the Saturday evening, Pope Leo XIV returned once more to gratitude, the same note he had struck a year earlier in his very first address and again in his Easter letter. "I count on you," he told them, "to help me discern what the Spirit is saying to the Church today. I need your support, strong, explicit, and public. I need to feel sustained by you as brothers." There is something almost disarming in a pope admitting, in a formal address, on the record, before the assembled leadership of a 2,000-year-old institution, that he needs to feel sustained. Not that he commands their sustenance, that he needs to feel it. This is where the story arrives at its real centre. The small human detail the entire arc has been circling since the Easter morning that started it. Strip away the titles, Holy Father, Your Eminence, Successor of Peter, and what remains is simpler than any of it. A man roughly a year into carrying a responsibility he himself described as far beyond his own limited powers, writing letters and standing in halls and repeating, in a dozen different phrasings across 14 months, the same essential request: talk to me honestly, and let me talk honestly back to you. Not obedience first, conversation first, not silence mistaken for unity, but disagreement offered in good faith and received as an act of communion. That is the private message that has everyone talking, not because it was hidden, but because so few expected a pope to say it so plainly, so often, and in writing that anyone could later go back and read for themselves. In an age when religious institutions are frequently accused, sometimes fairly, of demanding loyalty while punishing honesty, a letter that explicitly asks cardinals for their freedom, their frankness, and their loyalty, in that order, freedom named first, reads less like routine correspondence and more like a quiet redefinition of what leadership inside the Church is supposed to look like. None of this resolves the tensions still running through global Catholicism. It does not settle debates over liturgy or synodality, or how quickly change should come, or whether it should come at all. Pope Leo XIV never claimed it would. What his letters and his consistories reveal instead is a method, patient, repetitive, almost stubborn in its insistence that the conversation itself matters as much as any single conclusion drawn from it. A resource of lasting value, he called the contributions from that January consistory. Not a final answer, a resource. Something meant to be returned to, reflected on, allowed to mature slowly through discernment, the way real trust between people always has to mature, not by decree, but by showing up for the conversation again and again, and choosing honesty each time it would be easier to choose silence. That, in the end, is the line worth carrying out of this story. That communion is never achieved once and for all, but has to be chosen daily, in small acts of listening that rarely make headlines on their own, until enough of them, gathered together, become impossible to ignore. What made this pattern so striking, though, is that it was never received as uncomplicated. A message this personal, coming from a man holding this much authority, was always going to generate friction as well as warmth. And the friction is part of the story too, because it shows the letters were not simply theatre. In the days leading up to the June consistory, word had already spread that not everyone inside the college felt the invitation to frankness was being matched by genuine openness in structure. Some cardinals, speaking on condition that their unease be reported rather than silenced, described the January gathering as a controlled affair. Round tables, 3-minute interventions. A sense that the framing of every conversation had been set before they ever sat down. One of Pope Leo XIV's own senior theologians, Cardinal Gerhard Müller, said plainly that many of his brother cardinals preferred open plenary debate to small table discussions, and were uneasy about being asked to repeat that same format a second time. It is a small, human detail, easy to miss inside a story about papal warmth. The very men being told they were free to speak frankly were some of them, using that freedom to say the format itself did not feel free enough. Pope Leo XIV did not ignore this. He built a response directly into the June gathering. A final 90-minute session of what organisers called free dialogue was added to the schedule. No preset questions, no table structure, simply cardinals rising to speak for a few minutes each, in whatever direction they chose. Alongside it, something smaller, but in some ways more telling. A dedicated email address, created specifically so that any cardinal anywhere in the world could write to the Pope directly, outside the formal sessions, to share advice or concerns he might not feel comfortable raising in a crowded hall. It is one thing to stand at a podium and ask 200 men for their frankness. It is another to quietly build them a door they can use in private, long after the cameras in the Paul VI hall have been switched off. That door mattered, because some of what came through it, and through the free dialogue session itself, touched subjects with real weight behind them. Cardinal Tarcisio Isao Kikuchi of Tokyo later told reporters that several participants had gone so far as to propose a collective statement of support for the Pope's position on war, a position he had laid out, unusually bluntly for a papal homily, on the opening morning of the consistory, telling the assembled cardinals that war is never blessed by God, and that even a humanity equipped with the most advanced weapons still carries the intelligence and free will to resolve conflict as human beings rather than as beasts. Not every cardinal present agreed on how far that teaching should be pushed. Cardinal Robert McElroy suggested that the centuries-old framework of just war theory, developed through the writings of Augustine and Aquinas, had in practice become what he called an elastic set of criteria, one that governments could bend to justify almost anything, and that further theological study, not a single statement, was what the moment actually required. Because not every cardinal in the college had been able to travel to Rome for the meeting, the idea of a unified declaration was set aside. Instead, individual bishops' conferences were encouraged to voice their own support, in their own countries, in their own words, a small, almost anticlimactic ending to a big debate, but one entirely consistent with everything Pope Leo XIV had been saying since his first hour in office. Not a decree handed down, a conversation handed back. Cardinal Antoine Kambanda of Kigali, describing the same 2 days, said simply that the discussions reflected different perspectives. A modest sentence, but one that confirmed something the Vatican Press Office could never have announced as effectively itself, that the frankness the Pope had asked for in his opening address had actually been exercised, that the room had not simply nodded along, and that disagreement, exactly as he had described it back in April, had been received as an act of communion rather than a breach of it. It is this second layer of the story, not the warmth alone, but the warmth tested against real disagreement and holding, that explains why the phrase everyone kept repeating afterward was not guardians of particular interests. Pope Leo XIV had used that exact image early in his opening address, reminding the cardinals that their office was never meant to protect factions, regional loyalties, or personal legacies, but to serve as disciples called into communion with Christ and through him with one another. For an institution sometimes accused of exactly that kind of factionalism, blocks forming around geography, around liturgical preference, around competing visions of reform, a pope naming the temptation out loud, to the very men most capable of succumbing to it, was its own kind of frank counsel, offered in the opposite direction this time, from the chair of Peter back down to the college. By the time the consistory closed on the evening of June 27th, what had travelled furthest in the Catholic press was not any single doctrinal outcome, because there was no single doctrinal outcome to announce. What travelled was the shape of the whole encounter, a private letter in April that asked for patience and mission before instruction, a public address in June that asked, twice over, for freedom, frankness and loyalty in that order, a schedule quietly redesigned mid-process to answer cardinals' own private complaints about being too controlled, and a private email address built for the ones who still weren't ready to say something out loud. None of it was hidden. All of it was, in its own quiet way, unusual. And that combination, total transparency about a method most popes have kept behind closed doors, is very likely the real reason a letter thanking cardinals for their contributions, and a homily condemning war, and a small procedural adjustment to a meeting schedule, all ended up, within the same short season, being talked about as if they were one continuous message. Because in every real sense, they were. If this kind of close reading of Pope Leo XIV's pontificate is valuable, consider subscribing for continuing coverage, and leave a comment sharing which of his lines struck you the most.